Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday the 7th, where we are in the midst of talking about the sonnets. So last class we talked a little bit about Shakespearean history and Shakespearean theaters and also Shakespearean language. I hope you enjoyed the video on the Three Little Pigs to give you an idea that once you understand the plot, then you can really appreciate nuances of Renaissance language. I wanted to begin not with a complete story, however, but with Shakespeare's sonnets. And this would serve as nice preparation for us to get a sense of Renaissance English and also anticipate some of the themes we'll be encountering over the course of the semester. And as we talked about, the sonnets, we think, were written primarily during times of plague when the theater houses would have been closed. There are 154 sonnets. We're reading just a handful just to give you a little bit of a taste. And the sonnets are highly structured poems. So they had very clear rules in terms of things like length, 14 lines, in terms of rhyme pattern or rhyme scheme, ABAB, CD, EFGG, and you can test this by looking at the last line or the last word of each line, and it should follow that pattern. You have a 10-syllable line, so that's iambic pentameter. And the last two lines will rhyme together. That will be a couplet, and they will basically serve as a kind of concluding paragraph, if you will, for the sonnet itself. And then ultimately, what you will be seeing as well is that the sonnets will discuss some major themes that are considered to be lofty or important, themes that we will revisit again when we talk about Shakespearean dramas. So, the early set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, somebody that gave him political and perhaps economic support. And the latter set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a dark lady, dark in terms of her features, her eyes, and her hair in particular, someone that Shakespeare had perhaps an infatuation with, at the very least, at the very most, an active affair. And for us, this means that sonnets 15, 18, and 20, the three first sonnets that I had assigned from the early set of sonnets, are thought to have been written to a young man. And the later set of sonnets, sonnets 127, 130, and 151, are thought to have been written to a dark lady. Some of the sonnets are general enough so that they can be applicable to lots of different situations. I think that's one of the beauties of Shakespeare, is that you can utilize his sonnets, or oftentimes utilize some of his sonnets in many different instances and for many different occasions. Some sonnets are very clearly written to a specific person. And when you're reading those sonnets out loud, I had suggest, or when you're reading those sonnets, I had suggested that you read them out loud because you want to listen to the nuances of the language. I myself am going to be reading some of the sonnets out loud, then to try to paraphrase it, put it in your own language, and then reread and try to appreciate the nuances of language. Of course, you can identify some themes and things like imagery and symbolism and metaphor and rhyme. And also, we can spend an entire semester on sonnets. This is just preparing us for some of the major plays. And our first play is going to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. So I had indicated that it's best to read ahead, especially because we had a snow day. So my hope is that when we transition into A Midsummer Night's Dream next class, that you have read the play in its entirety. However, I know that my hope and reality are oftentimes two different things. We've got multiple classes devoted to A Midsummer Night's Dream so that you can finish reading it, and also so that we can watch performance and talk about performance. But what would be ideal is if you have indeed finished Midsummer Night's Dream, that you are beginning the next play in the series, and that happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. And luckily, I've been able to find online links, so I will provide you with the online link from the Folger. You'll notice that the links I'm sharing with you online are from the Folger Library, the basically definitive library for Shakespearean studies in the United States, with the largest collection of Shakespearean works. However, you can find these works in a lot of different places, and I encourage you to use paper. I like personally the idea of being able to annotate. So whether you use an anthology such as the Riverside that includes everything, or you are using separate texts, whether they be published by Signet or Pelican. Those are two very good publishers. The Folger itself is another publisher. But you want to have some good footnotes so that that'll help you understand with some of the language. And the first sonnet, Sonnet 15, is a sonnet that I wanted to talk a little bit about in the context of Sir Patrick Stewart. Now, you might be familiar with Sir Patrick Stewart, a renowned actor. He was Shakespearean trained, by the way. You may or may not know that because he's known for popular films, and he also is known for a popular television series. Probably his most well-known role would be as Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek. And again, Shakespearean trained, has a wonderful voice. During the early days of the pandemic, he began a project where he would read a sonnet a day. And he was quite sure that he would obviously run out of pandemic days before he ran out of sonnets. And as we know, that's the exact opposite of what happened. He ran out of sonnets before we ran out of pandemic days and lockdown. But what he did was give us this wonderful gift so that each day he recorded himself informally during lockdown reading the sonnets. And as most things, you can find it online. And I encourage you to listen to Patrick Stewart's reading. I included a link to Sonnet 15, the first sonnet that we're talking about. But you can find him reading all of the sonnets, with reading the last sonnet in tuxedo and a bottle of champagne. Only Patrick Stewart would do something like that. But at any rate, I wanted to read to you Sonnet 15. Of course, I'm not going to be able to give it the kind of justice that Patrick Stewart did, so bear with me. But Sonnet 15 reads, "When I consider everything that grows, holds imperfection, but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, wherein the stars in secret influence comet. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked by the same self-sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most right in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night. And all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new." Notice those last two lines, the couplet, are indented. They're serving as a summary for the poem. The idea of the use of I or you in the poem, that his poems tend to be very personal. Again, we think this poem was written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, perhaps the Earl of Southampton. Though it's general enough so that it could be applicable to a lot of different people. Note all of the vegetation imagery. This is very typical in Shakespeare, where he would oftentimes make reference to the natural world and draw parallels with the human world. The reference to a stage in the third line, "At this huge stage presented naught but shows." There's a term called metadrama, where you are deliberately drawing attention to the fact that what you are watching is drama. Shakespeare would oftentimes do this, either making a reference to the world being a stage and men being merely players, or actually inserting a play within a play to remind us that we're watching a play. This is something that we'll see in Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, this is something that we see in the sonnet as well. So we see lots of parallels between humanity and the natural world, which is something that we will see in the plays as well. The theme is about aging. Again, that was considered to be a lofty theme in Shakespeare. And about change. And that's also another theme that you will find in Shakespeare, that there is always change. The conceit of this inconstant stay. And of course, notice the capitalization for words like time and decay. This gives a sense of personification, as if time and decay were the actual enemies. Personification giving human qualities to inanimate objects. The idea of engrafting And this is obviously a term from gardening, but it also is an applicable term for the artist, that the artist can bring new life through the power of their poetry, the power of their verse. And it's something that we will definitely see in the next sonnet, in Sonnet 18. But what we see is that the poet has the possibility of immortalizing through verse, which gives the poet a kind of godlike power, because only God, at least according to the chain of being, has the ability to offer immortal life. Oh, and Shakespeare. And if we read his poetry and believe his words, and of course, we're still reading his words centuries later, so I guess he was correct on some levels. I like the idea of also the rising and the falling, because this is something that not only simulates the life cycle but also the progress of what we're going to see in the plays. The plays being a kind of pyramid structure. So we are rising up, much like the left hand side of a pyramid, to a pinnacle, to the point of conflict, and then we have a descent. And one could say that that mimics basically, again, our lifespan. Sonnet 18, perhaps the best known sonnet of all of the sonnets. And again, none of the sonnets were titled, so we refer to the sonnets by their numbers, and scholars have tried to put them in some organizational order. And we can either refer to number or by the first line. And this is very similar with Emily Dickinson, by the way, if you're familiar with Emily Dickinson's poetry. And Sonnet 18, again, perhaps the most well-known sonnet, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now notice that if in the notes below that not only have I included a link to Patrick Stewart reading the first sonnet, Sonnet 15, I encourage you to listen to it because it's quite beautiful. I've also included a link for Sonnet's audiobook where you can hear all the sonnets read out loud if you so wanted to. And certainly you can purchase versions of that as well, but this was a free link that I wanted to share with you, and they don't do too bad of a job considering that it's a free link. And that said, whether you listen to somebody reading the sonnet or you read it yourself or some combination thereof, the most commonly misread poem, perhaps on the face of the planet, is Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So I wanted to read that to you. Again, you can listen to Patrick Stewart or any of the other readings, Sonnet's audiobook or something else. And in Sonnet 18, we're asked a question. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and oft is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And the reason why this is perhaps the most misread sonnet is because individuals will say that this is a love poem that was written to a woman. Keep in mind, again, that the early set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a man, probably Shakespeare's patron. So as you know, we have very little information about Shakespeare. So if you like conspiracy theories, you can plug in all kinds of conspiracy theories, including a conspiracy theory about what was Shakespeare's sexuality. And oftentimes this poem is used as an example to illustrate that perhaps Shakespeare was homosexual or bisexual, that there is some sort of erotic element associated with this poem. But there's nothing erotic about it. Read the poem carefully, and you'll see that it's more a poem of flattery, certainly not of sexuality. We'll read some poems that are obviously sexual in a few moments. So it would seem to make sense that one would want to flatter one's patron because one's patron is providing political and economic support. In the hyperbole, the extreme exaggeration is also a convention that you would find in poetry because no one can live up to this level of beauty and perfection. And in fact, we're going to read a sonnet that addresses just that shortly. But the question, should I compare thee or you to a summer's day? And think about all of the associations with summer, and usually they're quite positive. This is the epitome of perfection. But in theory, the summer, and the same with daytime. So the seasons are oftentimes used to represent stages of life. So the spring would be the beginning of life, summer would be the height of life, fall would be the beginning of descent, winter would be descent. Same with times of day. This is old literary symbolism that you will find in many texts. So that the morning would be the beginning of life, and then noon would be the height of life, and then afternoon would be descent, and then evening would ultimately be the ending. So the idea of summer's day is supposed to represent the pinnacle of perfection. And yet, as we hear in the second line, thou or you art more lovely and more temperate. In other words, you're more predictable than a summer's day. How? And basically, we have an entire sonnet that talks about some of the negatives associated with summer's flaws. Note the nature imagery again. That rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Sometimes it's too windy. I like the line where he says, summer's lease hath all too short a date. The idea of leasing something, that you don't own it, that is something that you merely borrow. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. Well, the eye of heaven being the sun. Of course, you might ask yourself, well, why didn't he just say that? Sometimes the sun is too hot. Remember the structure of a sonnet, where you've got to keep to a certain level of rhyme scheme, a certain length, and even a certain number of syllables per line. Not an easy thing to do. The sun is oftentimes in literature referred to as a he, which is what we get in this poem. His gold complexion is dimmed. In other words, it becomes cloudy. And the moon, by the way, is oftentimes referred to as a she. And when we hear that every fair from fair sometime declines, fair is not used in terms of justice, which is the contemporary usage of the word. Fair is used in terms of beauty. So if you know your fairy tales, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? And the idea is that all beauty experiences descent, whether it happens through chance, in other words, accident, or it happens through nature's course, in other words, aging. But regardless, this person has, according to Shakespeare, an eternal summer. Again, that's an exaggeration. None of us can be eternally perfect. But according to Shakespeare, oh, yes, you can. And death will not wander in this person's presence. Notice that death is capitalized, again personifying death. Of course, we all die, so we need to get to the last two lines. So long as men can breathe, I believe we're breathing right now, or eyes can see, and I'm hopeful that we are all seeing. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And the ending line might be somewhat complex because of the word this, which is a pronoun. And a pronoun takes the place of a noun. And you want to be clear, usually when you're writing, let's say an academic paper, when you are using a pronoun, that within that sentence you identify the noun beforehand. So it's clear what the pronoun is replacing. In this particular instance, we don't have that, nor do we need that, because in creative writing you can break all the rules. But I'll supply you the noun that's being replaced with the pronoun this. So long lives this poem. And this poem gives life to thee. And once again, the idea that poetry can immortalize through verse, giving a godlike power to the poet and specifically to Shakespeare himself. And it's true, as subversive as it might be for Shakespeare likening himself to a god, here we are in 2024, talking about the beauty of this individual. So the last of the early sonnets that I wanted to review is Sonnet 20. This one is very clearly written to a young man. So I wanted to give you a sonnet that was very clearly written to a particular poet or a particular person, rather than sonnets 15 and 18 that are general enough to be applicable in lots of different situations. And Sonnet 20, also known as A Woman's Face with Nature's Own Hand Painted. I'll read to you. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false woman's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue and all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes, women's souls, amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, thy treasure. Once again, we see a personification of nature with nature capitalized, and we see punning, master mistress. So the first line says that this person was given a woman's face, or the beauty of a woman's face, and that this person is the master mistress of the author. And of course, master is male, mistress is female, not necessarily with the negative connotation that we have of mistress today, an illicit affair, just somebody who is female. And that this person has all of the best qualities of female, but none of the negatives. Of this person has a woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false women's fashion. So someone who isn't fickle, as women can be. Again, notice how Shakespeare's playing into some of the stereotypes of the time. An eye more bright than theirs, less false and rolling. And of course, the idea of rolling, in other words, using one's eye to try to flirt. Gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. The idea that this person is so beautiful that it can actually turn what its gazes on into gold. A man in hue and all hues, which steals men's eyes. Men are jealous of this person's beauty. And women's souls amazeth. And women are basically amazed by this person. For a woman wert thou first created. So this is a man that's supposed to be created for a woman. Till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting. Nature's fallen in love with this creation. And by addition, me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. So this person has the addition of one thing, which makes a relationship, or at least a heterosexual relationship, between Shakespeare and the subject of this poem impossible, and that's the penis. But since she pricked thee out, in other words, she found thee out, she basically chose these out. But if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary, and I'm talking about the original Oxford English Dictionary, not a condensed version, the Oxford English Dictionary lists all of the words that have been used in the English language, and it also lists usages over time. So you have examples from pieces of literature. In the old days, when it was a printed text, it looked much like an encyclopedia, one of those old encyclopedias with multiple volumes. Now, of course, you can find it online, which means that each definition within the Oxford English Dictionary is probably many pages long, with lots of references with how that word was used throughout history and how its meaning has changed. Well, look up the word pricked, which I did, and according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first usage in 1592 of the word prick as sexual slang occurred. It was right around the time Shakespeare's writing. So Shakespeare loves to pun, the suggestion of sex, and it makes perfect sense, since the previous line was talking about penis, that we would use something like a slang term for penis as well. Mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. So notice, this sonnet of idealization. This is what you oftentimes find in the early sonnets. The sexual references, the phallic imagery, the falsehoods of cosmetics and fashion. This is how women can become false. This is a theme that we will see throughout the plays. So we could read many of the early sonnets, but I wanted to give you 3 of the later sonnets, just so that you can see some of the changes. Again, the later sonnets thought to have been written to what is known as the dark lady, because she had dark eyes and hair, not necessarily dark skin. Lots of speculation as to who this dark lady might be, and whether or not Shakespeare was having an active relationship with her, or whether it was just an infatuation. In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter, because we have the texts themselves. And Sonnet 127 So we're working with the later set of sonnets. Talks a little bit about some of the societal conceptions of beauty, something that Shakespeare challenges in many of his plays. Again, rather progressive. So, as old as Shakespeare is, in many ways, he's quite modern. And we're told in Sonnet 127, in the old age, in other words, in the good old days, back in the day is the expression we might use today. In the old days, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress's eyes are raven black, her eyes are suited, and as they mourners seem, at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. So, this sonnet very, very clearly talks about the stereotypical idea of beauty, which is fair features. That's something that perhaps even exists today. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Keep that in mind when we are reading and discussing A Midsummer Night's Dream, as we're presented with two women, one who is fair and one who is a brunette, and who gets the attention and why. But that true beauty resides in darkness. And I think that in some ways this kind of anticipates the tragedies. As negative as the tragedies can be, they can also be quite beautiful. That there is a beauty associated with darkness. I think I might have told you that I teach a class in Gothic literature, and I think Gothic literature sort of embraces that idea. And notice some of the punning that's going on here when he talks about air and H-A-I-R, the hair that someone has, but H-E-I-R, air, and the idea of family lines here as well. And also critical of cosmetics, that's fairing the foul, or I should say fouling the fair. I'm sorry. It's a false face, if you will. And cosmetics are illegitimate, again, which goes to the idea of what is a natural heir or what is a bastard. The idea of bastard or not being a clear heir is something that we will literally see in plays such as Much Ado About Nothing. But bloodlines were very important during Shakespeare's time. This is how inheritance was decided, for instance. And this sense, that there is a certain level of facade or deception that oftentimes is found in beauty or false beauty. Facades and deceptions are a common theme in Shakespeare's plays. In fact, oftentimes Shakespeare will set his plays in places like masquerade balls just to talk about the mask that we all wear. And this theme continues with the next sonnet. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, Sonnet 130. And I think that this sonnet is in direct contrast to Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Because Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day was a sonnet that was filled with exaggeration and hyperbole. Nobody could live up to that standard. And this was a common literary technique of the time for poets to basically put the subject of the poet on a pedestal, if you will. Sonnet 130 is very much a sonnet of reality that is in direct contrast to that, saying, my mistress's eyes, and keep in mind again that mistress would be in relation to a woman, not necessarily somebody that is engaged in an illicit affair. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have some roses damasked, red and white. Or I've seen roses damasked, red and white. But no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet by heaven I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. So if you think about some of the cliches that are associated with poetry, that someone should be brighter than the sun, and the subject of the poet is nothing like of this poem is nothing like the sun. That this person doesn't have naturally red lips. That coral is far more red. And again, we see over and over again the deflation of the romanticized, idealized poetry. So this is as much a critique of that form of poetry. Again, a poem that perhaps is incredibly well known. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, using that technique? But Shakespeare can also question and subvert that as well. If hairs be wires, well, then black wires grow on her head. That's not a compliment to say that her hair is not smooth or silky. And I've seen roses damask red and white, but she doesn't have a natural blush in her cheek. Again, oftentimes you talk about rosy cheeks. And in some perfumes, there's more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. Reeks at the time would have been used as exhaled. It didn't necessarily have the negative connotation that it does today. I love to hear her speak, but no, her voice doesn't sound like music. No one's voice does. And yes, I never saw a goddess move, but when she walks on the ground. So, the idea of portraying someone as being so nimble or so or so graceful that they float, that's not realistic. But yet, notice the last two lines. And again, this is kind of our summary. And yet by heaven, I think my love is rare as any she belied with false compare. Saying that my love is as extraordinary and unique as any that could be corrupted by, again, falsehoods of beauty. And this sonnet of realism might be perhaps a much more powerful sonnet than Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, because it's a sonnet that perhaps illustrates our own experiences with others and with ourselves. So in many ways, it's the antithesis to Sonnet 18. I wanted to end with Sonnet 151 because this sonnet is very clearly written to the Dark Lady and also uses some sexual punning. And Shakespeare was quite bawdy. You could very openly talk about sex and violence during the time. You just couldn't talk about politics, as I had mentioned last class, at least not openly. So you had to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more discreet. That said, this was a society of contradiction, and we might say our own society is a society of contradiction. As sexually bawdy as the time might have been, virginity was particularly important, especially for female at the time. That's going to be a major theme when we read something like A Midsummer Night's Dream. But Sonnet 181, and of course Sonnet 151, and of course there are other sonnets as well that we could be talking about, but I'll end with Sonnet 151. Love is too young to know what conscience is. Love is too young to know what conscience is, yet who knows not conscience is born of love? Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss, lest guilty of my faults thy sweet self prove. For thou betray me, I do betray my nobler part to my gross body's treason. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Flesh stays, no farther reason. But rising at that name doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. Proud of this pride, he is contented thy poor drudge to be, to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side. No want of conscience hold it that I call her love, for whose dear love I rise and fall. This is definitely a poem about conscience and morality and the struggle between the flesh, which wants to basically be satisfied, and the soul, which wants to have a higher level of love. And the spirit, while it might be pure, is ultimately corrupted by the flesh, the need for physical love. And there's a lot of phallic imagery here where we talk about my nobler part, which would be the soul, to my gross body's treason. In other words, that his body continues to be sexually aroused even though he's trying to have a more pure love. And then we talk about rising and falling. He's making reference to a penis here and erection. rising at that name, point out the you as his triumphant prize. Notice all these P sounds, the alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. Prize, pride, proud, of course, penis. He is contented thy poor drudge to be, to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side. And again, the idea of the erection, rising and falling. Affair could be business, but it can also be a sexual relationship. No want of conscious hold it that I call her love. Obviously, this sonnet is written to a female with the pronoun her love. For whose dear love I rise and fall. In other words, being a slave to passion, specifically being a slave to sex and physical desire. This is also a theme that we will see in Shakespeare as well. And as you know, we had a snow day, so I'm trying to move a little bit more quickly, and I have been, I believe, so that we can get pretty close to where we are with the syllabus. I'll have a few closing words, I think, about the sonnets next class, and then we can begin talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespearean comedies, and also begin talking about our first paper, which won't be due until approximately midway through the semester. But I have rolling deadlines, and I encourage you to start earlier rather than later. So I'll give you some suggested paper topics, and as the semester progresses, we'll talk about some writing techniques. You can hand in the paper at any point. I hope that you hand in your paper by the midpoint of the semester. That's not to say that you couldn't hand it in afterwards, but I'm becoming a bit anxious at this point if you haven't handed it in by the midpoint, because you want to have some feedback. And everybody has the option of doing a revision of that first paper after I return it back to you and I give my commentary on it. If you're content with your grade, you're done, but if not, you could revise it for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in the original with my commentary on it, along with your revision, and you get the higher of the two grades. So I see the first paper is a kind of learning exercise. That's done very deliberately in this class. You would have up until the ending of the semester to submit in that paper, but obviously, or revision, I should say, but obviously the sooner you hand it in, the better. And the first paper will be devoted to the first half of the semester, which would probably be the comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream and Much Ado About Nothing. Though there is a possibility of writing about sonnets. Those sonnets are a different kind of animal altogether. Writing about a drama is very different than writing about a 14-line poem. But while I will give you some suggested paper topics, you can also create a topic of your own as long as you have it approved by me. So you can begin thinking now as we revisit this. And what's left for today is our attendance question, which would be due on Friday the 9th on our discussion form. Again, if you need additional time, please let me know. And as you can see, I respond to all of your responses. So I am reading what you're writing. That counts as your attendance. Your response isn't evaluated. And I oftentimes ask questions that are opinion-based so that they couldn't be evaluated anyway, because I'm more interested in your reasoning and in your thinking. And certainly, you're encouraged to respond to your classmates, just like you would in a live class if you felt compelled, let's say, or motivated to raise your hand and make a comment. But you're not required to respond to your classmates. You are required, however, to read your classmates' responses and all of my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea of what we would do in the second part of the class with the class discussion. So, today's attendance question is, out of the sonnets that we've read for class, out of the 6, which one was your favorite and why? Again, no right or wrong answer necessarily here. I'm more interested in your thinking. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class, transitioning out of sonnets and into Shakespearean drama, specifically comedy. Take care. Bye-bye.